My hunch, just a hunch, is that underlying that performance is also that kind of idea that, look, Olympics is all about inclusivity. We've got countries from all over the world. We're going to include so many different sports. There's Olympic breakdancing and there's Olympic this, that, and the other thing. And our inclusivity is going to be reflected in the fact that we also, include transgenders and bearded women and all of these other sorts of things. And the subtle attack on Christianity may be part of this view that we're even more inclusive than that. There's a general tendency discussed by philosophers like Heidegger in dealing with everyday events. Everybody wants to talk about what's going on, but nobody really hits the nail on the head. Nobody really understands. Everybody's got a curiosity about what's going on and discusses it without understanding it, resulting in public ambiguity. In some sense, for some people, the event had divine significance because of how, everybody saw the images of Trump turning his head and how close of a call that was. And you might think, okay, it gives you occasion for philosophizing. What happens to a person who comes so close to death? Is this going to change who he is? Well, it did for about 5 minutes. The culminating moment is the one where I had the impression, once we were already on the road, that I would be free to leave. He gave me that impression. He gave me that false impression. And he let me know that I would be, punished, basically, for wanting to leave.
What's up, guys? This time I sit down with Michael Millerman. Michael teaches political philosophy and is the founder of the Millerman School, where he gives lectures ranging from Plato's Republic to Heidegger's Being and Time to Leo Strauss's On Tyranny. He's the author of Beginning with Heidegger and Inside Putin's Brain. I first discovered Michael on his YouTube channel where he posted a video titled, "Why is Everything Normal Called Fascist?" And from there, I went on a deep dive of the Millerman rabbit hole, and I knew that I had to have this guy on the pod. In this episode, we get into the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, the nature of existing in today's hectic, fast-paced world, what sparked Michael to dedicate his life to teaching philosophy and politics, the insane story of the traveling mystic, aka Storm Corleone, and more. If you'd like to support the AUXORO Podcast, please subscribe on YouTube and Spotify. This is a huge help for getting the word out about the show because the more subscribers and ratings we have, the more that the overlord algorithm recommends our show to other people. You can also subscribe to AUXORO Premium, where for $5 a month you get bonus episodes, exclusive AMAs, minisodes, and more, so you can go check that out at auxoro.supercast.com. Thank you for however you choose to support. And now, without further ado, please enjoy this deep-diving, wide-ranging episode with the man, Michael Millerman. Michael Millerman, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, great to be with you too. I thought an interesting place to start, since I was stalking your Twitter feed, doing some preparation for the conversation, you tweeted a little while ago that these days, if you fall into a coma and wake up 6 hours later, the world is unrecognizable. So I wanted to ask you, what part of your existence or what part of the world has felt the most unrecognizable to you lately?
So first, I would just say something, which is that I put the emphasis there on how quickly some things are changing. But I teach and study old books of philosophy and political science, thousands of years old, like Plato's Laws, for example, Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics. And those books tell us that there are also constants in political life that don't change. So there are some things that stay the same in all periods. But when I wrote what I wrote, it was the assassination attempt, the replacement of Biden, the Kamala, the vibe change from what seemed like what was going to be a clear Trump victory to suddenly the media pumping up Kamala as a viable presidential candidate. So it's that surface level of politics, which still matters. And that's changing a lot. World order, I think, is changing pretty quickly. That's a slightly slower process, but still. But that's what I had in mind, was contemporary American political events, which were just, on one hand, you had Trump and Biden, then a week later, you had the assassination and the replacement and all the rest of it. So I think that was moving pretty quickly. And I would also say that for all we know, in the next 4 months or so, there could be a lot of additional things that seem like they're happening at breakneck speed. One of those weeks where decades happen. So the underlying architecture of political life as such, I think, is largely unchanged or untouched, but we live, on all levels simultaneously. We're closer to the surface than we are to the depths. So those fast and furious changes do affect us too.
Yeah, I had similar thoughts when the Trump assassination happened. I didn't put them together in my head as eloquently as you just did, but I remember when the assassination first happened, I was actually on my way to dinner with friends, and I sat down, we ordered drinks, and then one of my friends pulled his phone out and said, "Trump just got shot." And my first thought was bull fucking shit. There's no chance Trump got shot. You're getting trolled right now. And then went to the bathroom probably 20 minutes later, just pulled out my phone, had that in the back of my head. And then I'm going through all these stories. And I just remember having a moment where I thought that things were just shifting, not necessarily under me, but shifting. The world was shifting in a way where this was going to dominate the conversation, and this was going to change the way that we think about politics for at least this election and any election in the near future. And at the same time, I came back to the table, and 5 minutes later, we were talking about something different, just, our personal lives as friends do. So it's like this weird dichotomy of history is happening over cocktails, and also, what are we going to do this weekend? It just felt like this strange overlap of history onto personal life, where I've never really felt that before. When I was 9/11, not when I when it was 9/11, and I believe I was 9 years old, I didn't really have that sort of thinking because I just wasn't old enough to recognize the historical value of what was going on. But that the Trump assassination moment was pretty surreal in that aspect.
Yeah, and God can be, thank God he lived, right? So there's a world in which the assassination attempt had been successful, and then that may have seemed to impact daily life more. Like who knows exactly? Somehow it's like something almost broke. That's what the assassination attempt that failed is things were just barely kept from total catastrophe. So if that had succeeded, then maybe we would feel the impact of history and politics on our lives more directly in a dark sort of way. So that's part of it. But another one is just that events, sometimes by their own nature and sometimes by the fact that they're artificially propped up or suppressed, they can be memory holed pretty quickly. And I think that there's some deliberate attempt to make this assassination attempt go away because it was a sort of triumphal moment for him, the way that he reacted under fire. And it gave him a big boost. And, Democrats can't have the Republicans getting a big boost of any kind. So to demythologize and sort of deflate and move past that assassination attempt, it's both natural, life goes on, right? I mean, you and your friends, what are you going to do? Suddenly, you still have your lives to live and things still move on. But still, an attempted assassination on a president where every sort of protective measure failed. And this assassination attempt came after so many other attempts to remove him from the equation. There's a lot of reasons to be suspicious about all of that. But yeah, I would say it's easy for us to forget because there's always some new news in the news. And it's also easier to forget when it's artificially suppressed for electoral reasons. But it is bizarre though. And you wonder how many more bizarre things can still happen.
Yeah.
And then look, the election, it will change a lot of people's lives. It's going to matter for a lot of people. It's not going to matter for everybody. I mean, there are people who have lived a normal life under many different presidents and many different world affairs. And, the world keeps going. Our lives keep going, sort of regardless, unless we're like extremely closely tied up in political events, which I think most of us are not.
As someone who's deeply rooted in the world of philosophy and politics like yourself, when you look back to other historical assassinations or assassination attempts, because there have been many moments like that throughout history, and there have been many philosophers with genuinely great insights and very relatable insights surrounding these moments of attempted assassinations. Do you see anything interesting with the way that people or smart people have reacted, people that maybe consider themselves philosophers? Do you see anything interesting about the way that they've reacted to Trump's assassination versus the way that philosophers have reacted to historical figures trying to be taken out in the past?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't exactly know, to tell you the truth. So I haven't really looked at how people reacted and responded under other circumstances. But number one, there's the fact that he survived, which again changes the equation to a certain extent. Number two, there's the media environment. Like we live now, and it wasn't exactly the case at other periods of history with this onslaught of the current news. There's always something new shiny thing gathering our attention, circulating, making the rounds. Today it's the Olympic transgender. Tomorrow it's who knows what. Yesterday it was what it was yesterday. So there's always some new story held in the center of our attention. And there's a general tendency discussed by philosophers like Heidegger in dealing with everyday events. Everybody wants to talk about what's going on, but nobody really hits the nail on the head. Nobody really understands. Like everybody's got a curiosity about what's going on and discusses it without understanding it, resulting in public ambiguity. That's what Heidegger says in his book Being and Time. And that was true in the COVID period. Okay, everybody was talking, nobody really understood, and the result was public ambiguity. I think around this assassination attempt too, for some people, it was like, that's it, the election's over. Like you have old man Biden, you have Trump, Biden can't walk up the stairs to Air Force One. Trump just, showed courage under fire. It's like a done deal. And then 2 days later, it isn't. And now if you look around in Republican circles online, depending on whether you're reading comparatively intelligent or comparatively unintelligent people, the idea that Trump could lose is very, very real. And I wouldn't go so far as to say it's likely, but everybody understands that it's, much more possible now than it was when Biden was president. So, these are the circumstances that I don't know. I mean, in some sense, for some people, the event had divine significance because of how, everybody saw the images of Trump turning his head and how close of a call that was. And you might think, okay, it gives you occasion for philosophizing. Like what happens to a person who comes so close to death? Is this going to change who he is? Well, it did for about like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or a day or two, and then it didn't anymore. So that's interesting as well. What happens to a person when he comes close to death? And there are different people, like my neighbor could come close to death. I could come close to death. But when a presidential candidate comes close to death, you think it's going to have greater significance because so many hopes and dreams and so much it depends on a presidential candidate. That doesn't depend on just, anybody you pick off at random on the street. So it was interesting to see how it changed his demeanor. It was interesting to see the credit that he and others gave to divine intervention. But that's difficult too, because somebody did die and, somebody in the audience did die. So we're going to say God protected Trump, but didn't protect the other person. So, there's all of these sort of details that they can become material for reflection. Like philosophy in general, it can begin to reflect on anything significant in our lives, or even things that are apparently trivial in our lives. They can be matters for reflection. So something like, what does it mean to have an assassination attempt? What is it, what is this brush with death? What is divine intervention? Those are philosophically legitimate questions, but they're not raised automatically. And usually people just bump up for a second and then go back down to where, to their baseline state, whatever it was before something weird happened.
Yeah, I was going to say, it makes me wonder about whether the near-death experience is enough to change the way that someone looks upon the world or looks upon their place in what's happening, or you need some sort of reflection or step back period along with the near-death experience. Because someone like Trump or anyone running for president, if they have an assassination attempt committed against them, within minutes to hours, they're already preparing statements. They're thinking of how to make the next political move. There are all these things that are running through their head and being said to them by their political peers that are more about how are we going to respond to this than, how do you feel right now, or how is your soul? How do you let's unpack this a little bit. Someone just tried to kill you, and they almost did. Maybe take a week to 2 weeks off from the campaign. That's just not going to happen. And yeah, it's just interesting to think about it. If something like that happened to me, and I'm, would it be like some sort of ayahuasca experience or psychedelic experience where it changes how I perceive the world a little bit? Would I just go back to work the next day? Would I record a podcast the next day? Like, what would I do? What's the thing that drives the shift in worldview and the shift in how you view yourself?
Yeah, like I think you could imagine a bunch of different responses. Maybe somebody gets dark and brooding and melancholy, and suddenly they feel like the anxiety of death hanging all around them or something like that. He seemed to like mellow out for a little bit. Again, I'm talking about the immediate, the few days after.
Yeah.
He softened out a little bit, mellowed out a little bit, gracious and counting his blessings. He still had the comedy and the comedic charm. I don't think, I think only a bullet that hit him could actually put an end to that. Anything short of that, it's not going to work. So, but he's back. Basically, he's back to being himself. He's on the campaign trail doing his highlight reel. But it is important, I think, how he reacted under the circumstances. That was interesting. Not everybody would do that. His description of the obligation he felt to the audience at the rally, I thought that was very moving, touching, raw, genuine, authentic, and all the rest of it. But you're right that, I mean, a minute later, it becomes a question of how it gets spinned, how it gets packaged, how it gets presented. Even if he has every best intention, he's his authentic self. He's got a team of politicos around him, and that's the way it works. So there's one book I read last year called The Beginning of Politics. It's a commentary on the biblical book of Saul. And the reason I mention it is because one of the main arguments in that book, and again, they're looking at the Bible stories, right? So we're talking about things that are old, but that are still true. So if something's true, it doesn't matter if it's old. And the idea was that politics is always ambiguous when you're doing something out of genuine moral impulse and when you're doing it for your own benefit. Like every political action is ambiguous between those two interpretations. So it's kind of like it's inevitable. Whenever something gets pulled into the political domain, it can always be spun. It's always a question of interest, messaging. It just becomes material in the hands of the political operatives. Even if at some level it is still spiritual, it is still genuine, it is still moral, transformative, existential, whatever, all of these sorts of things. The minute it falls under the umbrella of politics, it acquires that extra level of ambiguity where it's like, oh, is he saying this because he means it, or is he saying it because it's going to message well? And that's just part of politics. So as an outsider, we always have to sort of try to at least weigh the balances, like how much of this is genuine, how much of this is messaging, and try to find our footing.
Yeah. And it's also like, does it matter if no matter how, if someone is, if there's an assassination attempt against someone, if someone has a near-death experience, whatever it is, and they're also a politician on the global stage, does it matter if they're actually experience a genuine existential crisis or a spiritual moment, a spiritual reckoning, or does it just come down to how people are going to perceive it? Like you said, people, no matter what someone like Trump says, or any politician at that level, if an assassination attempt happens to them, people are going to perceive it as, oh, this is the thing that's going to rate his campaign highest. This is why he's saying it. He's trying to galvanize the people, and he's trying to just say something that's going to have a positive effect on how others view him. And yeah, I don't know if it is possible to have a genuine existential moment like that if you're in the public sphere and people are just going to perceive whatever you say as some sort of maneuver.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, people who are commenting on it after the fact, and I think he himself at the Republican National Convention, when he commented on it, he gave the impression that, like, to take the outsider's perspective, he knew it was like a made for TV moment. So it was a genuine assassination attempt. By the way, people doubted that, right? Is it glass? Is it this? Is it that? Was it a setup? Why would they think it was a setup? Because it looked too good. His reaction was too picture perfect. The flag, the fist, the blood. I'm not saying that, right? But I'm saying people who are looking from the outside are so cynical about the manipulation of images that they would entertain the thought that the whole thing was a setup to produce images for the purpose of electioneering or whatever, which is crazy. So yeah, I mean, I wonder whether people in politics, this is not something I know, but I just wonder, together with you in some sense, whether they have clear insight into their own experiences and are able to distinguish when what they're feeling is like their genuine feeling and when what they're feeling is the sort of the image and the projection and the persona that they have to be for political purposes. I don't know. Probably in the case of Trump, that's even an extra level there because he's been so media savvy for his whole life. Like if you're super media savvy, do you see, you've got your duplicated self. I mean, you do too. I do too as podcast people, YouTube people, right? We're not just here. We also see ourselves on the screen and hear ourselves in the clips and everything else like that. So the management of a person's image and where they actually feel they're feeling. Like, have you ever seen those experiments where a person is sitting with like a fake arm on the table next to him and his own arm is like under the table, and the experimenter, if they hit the fake arm, like the person feels pain? It's because you identify with this prosthetic limb or whatever it is, something like that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've seen the one where they use the mirror and they make it. Is that the one that you're talking about where you're seeing the reflection of your arm? It's not your actual arm.
Yeah, something like that. But something's being hit that you feel the pain, even though it's not you, because you've identified with something that's not yourself. So how do, a politician is constantly not himself and not himself, So like would be difficult, I think, psychologically to really figure out if you wanted to. Trump doesn't seem to me like a soul searcher necessarily, which is probably good. If he was a navel gazer, he could never go back to the campaign trail. There'd be too much to think about. Whereas he's just out there hitting home runs with one-liners and all the rest of it. So but it's fodder for thinking about what, the psychology of these assassination attempts and all of that. Not to mention, as I say, the deeper, darker conspiracy theories about like, how is this allowed to happen with so much, so many telltale signs that something was afoot. You see videos of the shooter running across the roof and things like that. So that's separately from, what the assassination attempt, but still Trump might've thought like, look, I've got a secret security service. They didn't protect me from the basic thing they're supposed to protect me from. Like I've got insiders who are against me, but he didn't, right? He didn't say all this sort of stuff. He just went on. So yeah, it's a case study in something for sure. Not everybody would respond like that. I probably wouldn't. You have to think for yourself how you would. Yeah. But then again, that's why he's a unique figure in world history, for better or worse.
Yeah. Well, I've been lucky enough to speak with a couple people on the podcast who have been in situations where people are trying to kill them on a regular basis, like special forces or former Navy SEALs, things like that. And you're constantly putting yourself in the operational zone of a much higher probability of death than a civilian or even someone like Trump, someone who's not facing those types of attacks on a regular basis. And the types of words that I've heard from people who are facing violence on a regular basis is there's a lot of training and emotional suppression, and just you're doing repetitions that either mimic violent situations or you're being thrust into them yourself. And then you have the practice of acting in the moment. And with someone like Trump, who's not, that's just not part of presidential training, it seems to me that anything within like 30 seconds of the shot had to be genuine, because he has no sort of adrenaline suppression practice, or just like he's not doing repetitions of that, is what I'm saying. So whatever people are saying about, actions that he took after or speeches in the days following, I do think that fist pump might have been the least calculated thing that Trump's ever done. Just looking back on it.
He just has the right political instincts for the moment, especially when there's a media potential. Somehow like he didn't, this is not a cynical interpretation. I don't say he did what he did for the cameras. I don't say it was rehearsed. No, it seemed to be, especially his explanation of it at the Republican National Convention, it seemed to be completely genuine, spontaneous, 100%, unrehearsed. But it just goes to show you something about his political instincts. And, they've been, you don't get those instincts out of nowhere, but you also get them through something that he's been practicing his whole life, which is, he's entertainer, performer, media mogul. He knows how to take advantage of a great situation. He read the crowd. He understood what was needed. He knew his role in the situation, and he delivered. He delivered a very memorable and a very powerful moment. And then the media cycle just sucks the life out of it for a little bit, unless it's, put back into it by a Republican operative. So it's crazy. That's what I mean when I say that the world is changing so quickly. I mean, you have an event that was so significant. The response to it was so legendary, the fist bump and all the rest of it. And then it's just, gone. You know what I mean? Not gone, right? But inundated with other news, other information, other topics, other events and happenings. And it was only after that you had Biden resign, which was its own little thing because nobody had video of his resignation. There was a question about the letter. What did all of this signify? So it's just like you have crazy things accumulating, and only the most recent ones really capture the attention unless they're kept in play. Like January 6th, Democrats kept in play for a long time. They were able to make it a significant event well past what it merited. So that's what happens.
And you said 6 hours in a tweet, which, is it's an okay sleep, 6 hours, but it does feel like you go to sleep.
Sometimes like a person.
I was going to say, it does feel like sometimes you go to sleep and you wake up and you're like, what the fuck? And I don't know if it's the world is moving faster or just our perception is because of the constant bombardment of the media from all different directions. But yeah, it is like, it does feel like a 6 hour news cycle, like one sleep, and you're like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah. So I would say, yeah, for sure. But my thing about the 6 hours was before it used to be like, imagine a person was in a coma for 20 years, would they recognize the world after 20 years? So for us, things are moving so quickly that it's like, you fall asleep for 6 hours and you don't recognize it.
Yeah.
But a big challenge, I think, is to find the right balance between the constants and the variables of political life, because Peter Thiel talked about this in one of his recent interviews. He was asked whether he thinks positively or negatively about cyclical theories in effect of politics. And he said that he does not like, if I remember correctly, cyclical theories because they underemphasize what's new. But there are things that are new. There are new technologies. There are new sources of energy. There is or can be something unprecedented in political life. But the question is, how much of what's unprecedented and how much of what's precedented should we take into our equation? As I say, I'm teaching and reading all the time, old books like this beauty right here, Plato's Laws, one of my favorite. People know Plato, they know the Republic, they don't all know the laws. Strongly recommended. Okay, I'm telling everybody who reads to read Plato's Laws. It's written so long ago, but it gives you such a deep understanding of politics that clearly there are some things that don't change. He doesn't have to know about the internet. He doesn't have to know about transistors. He doesn't have to know about any of these sorts of things. First World War, Second World War, and nevertheless, he can teach us a lot of the basic ones and zeros of political life. But, we also don't want to discount what's new because then we may be blindsided or just, deliberately narrowing our view too much. So that's the thing. On one level, things are changing. On another level, they're not. We need to somehow take both levels into consideration. It's a big intellectual task because it's hard enough to just stay on top of the news. But now you have to, stay on top of what's above and below the news. And that's what I think, that's what an understanding of politics requires, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's ever been more difficult to understand these types of things because just to go back to the 6 hours or the crazy period of turnover, if you fell into a coma, like you said, for 20 years, but it was the year 1100 and you woke up in the year 1120, it would probably look like the same shit, more or less. But if you fell asleep in the year 2020 and you woke up in 2040, I couldn't even tell you what social media platform we're going to be on, or, if people are going to be walking around with headsets, or they're going to be more in some sort of alternate metaverse than real life. Like I genuinely don't know what 2040 is going to look like, or 2050, 2060. So it does seem like it's getting more and more difficult to predict those things. But then you can also go back to bedrock political thinkers and writings like the ones from Plato to try to make some sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we have to do because, like you said, imagine people, thankfully you have science fiction, you've got dystopian thinkers, utopian thinkers, all of these people who are tracing out the development of some newest technologies and imagining what the world would look like if those were widely adopted, let's say, if they were used well or abused. You could do that with Neuralink, you could do it with anything, and people like Musk, they're introducing enough significant changes at a fast enough rate that really you don't know for sure where things are going to be 15 or 20 years from now.
Yeah.
But if we're still dealing with human beings, and if there's still something relatively stable in human nature, then there should be some basics that we can understand. The most interesting thing about the technological developments in some sense is, can they replace human nature? Because you always have a fixed frame of reference if you think, look, humans are what humans have been, roughly. Okay, fine. Maybe millions of years of evolutionary scale or something like that. But if we're talking about thousands of years of people living in political communities, then we can have some understanding. Plato's world is not radically dissimilar to ours. That's why we can still learn from him. But if suddenly you have like everybody who's born has been genetically engineered and microchipped with Neuralink, and the minute they're born, they're plugged into network systems and all of this sort of thing, like if bioengineer, biotechnology, posthumanism, transhumanism, like that makes it harder to say that we're even dealing with the same thing.
Yeah.
We're no longer dealing with the same thing if that happens. And there are people who are legitimately worried about that, the prospect of that kind of future. So that's tricky too, for all the good that these new technologies bring, there's the concern, are they going to erase or destroy the underlying human being?
Yeah. Well, speaking of things that are changing, the Olympics opening ceremony of 2024 looked quite different than years past. People have used the words, some say normal and romantic, other people say satanic, degenerate, distracting. What are your thoughts on the 2024 Olympics opening ceremony?
So I'll say this. I didn't watch the whole thing. My understanding is long. And
it was hard to watch, by the way, if you didn't catch it live, because I was trying to look up clips and they were being taken down on YouTube left and right. So I had to find some obscure clips on Twitter.
Right. So just the parts that were most widely paraded as being contentious. My view is pretty simple, which is that hundreds of thousands of kids around the world are watching the opening ceremonies, I would imagine. Because these athletes, they inspire the next generation of young people to pick up sports. And if you're showing what basically amounts to pornography or, some sort of culture destroying transgenderism on the opening ceremony that most people are watching around the world with their kids, it's hugely inappropriate in my view. So if people want to put on some sort of performance that they think is artistically significant and so on, but that is, disrespectful. I mean, I say the kids watching is one thing, but it was disrespectful to a lot of religious, not that you have to pander to people's religious sensibilities, but if the eyes of the world are going to be on you, then you have a certain obligation to present the best foot forward. If you spit in the face of everybody who's watching, if you insult the decency and intelligence of everybody who's watching, if you take what's supposed to be a celebratory event for everybody, including children, and you make it, as I say, some sort of pornography, then that's disgusting. That would be my take on that. There's an old tradition of linking gymnastic exercises. Let's take that broadly to mean sports and athletics, with the state's goal of inculcating high ideals in the people. Okay, so like athletics and state ideals have always gone closely together because you have an opportunity to inspire people to high ideals, noble ideals, athletic excellence, beauty. It can also be fun. It can also be many different kinds of things. But, it shouldn't be what it was in those clips that circulated. They just completely screwed up. It's more than screwing up. It's deliberate insult. So I take the side of the people who felt that should have been omitted. Let's put it mildly. And all of that is to say that you can still criticize religion. You can still have your opinion about sex and gender. You can still do your Dionysian artistic whatever, okay, or orgiastic revelries. But you shouldn't do it when the eyes of the world are on you. You shouldn't do it when the eyes of children are on you. And you shouldn't debase athletics and make it some sort of sideshow like it was in those clips. Okay. Again, I can't comment on all of the opening ceremonies. I assume the rest were largely decent.
Yeah, I didn't see the entire opening ceremony, but I saw what I managed to dig up through some clips, which was the blue guy, the nearly naked blue guy that was supposed to be Dionysus, I believe. And there was the recreation of the Last Supper. There was the drag show. There was the metal performance with the metal band from France. I'm blanking out on the name right now. But those were the four major clips that I saw. And my initial reaction,
like drag show. No, there's no, the word drag show should not appear when you're thinking about athletic ceremony opening games watched by the whole world. Like, it shouldn't.
My reaction actually came in waves where I was watching the videos, and at first I thought, this is just fucking odd. Like, whatever this is, I'm not even sure what I'm watching, but it's odd and it just doesn't fit something that's you would think would be designed to funnel as many eyes as possible onto a global stage and not be a distraction to the athletes who are ultimately those are the stars of the Olympics. And so in terms of being a non-distraction and being a universal funnel into getting people excited and amped for the events, it did not do that, at least not for me.
No, it ended up having the opposite effect. It turned a lot of people. I know people boycotted the Olympics because of that. Some advertisers did. I know some viewers did, which I don't think is correct. I don't think it's fair to the athletes. But yeah, it had the opposite effect.
Yeah, there was the second part of my reaction was, okay, there's a guy who designed this, the creative director who designed this ceremony, and a bunch of people came together, and probably an hour before that ceremony, everyone thought this is going to be the fucking thing that people are talking about. We're going to change the Olympic ceremony where, I'm going to leave my mark. I'm going to be super creative. I'm going to shoot my fucking shot on the global stage. And going into a creative pursuit, I know what that's like to take shots, not on the global stage with, millions of people watching live, but just like things that you do and then you realize it did not have the intended effect or people are just disliking it. So I did feel, I don't know if sympathetic is the right word, but like I felt some sort of, I felt a respect for the guy taking the shot as an artistic show separate from the Olympics. It made me think and talk about it. Like I'm talking about it right now. And I respect that as a creator, getting people to think about it. And the third part of my reaction, which, maybe this is the washed up college baseball player in me with, parts of my degenerate soul coming out. But some of the best baseball players and some of the best athletes that I've played with were, degenerate drinkers, drug doers. There's a big side of sports that is degeneracy. And I think there's a lot of athletes who have that in their spirit. Not that it's meant to be shown on the global stage, but when people were talking about degeneracy in sports and how that has no place in the Olympic ceremony, the opening ceremony, I agree. And then there's also part of me that is like, well, if you were to poll athletes, how many of you are, engage in degenerate behaviors, doping? The Olympic Village is, essentially an orgy, from what I hear in many aspects. It's almost like the Olympic ceremony reflected some aspects of athletic degeneracy that aren't normally given the main stage. And I don't know if they should be. Maybe that should just be locker room talk for athletes behind closed doors of like, what'd you do this weekend? Or, just like shooting the shit amongst guys. But for better or worse, those were the three parts of my reaction: the oddness of it, the artistic value of it, and the degenerate nature of athletes being somewhat represented by the opening ceremony.
Yeah, that's good. It's a nuanced reaction to what a lot of people had a pretty unnuanced reaction to, which is just straight up rejection and moralizing and posturing and all of that. I was guilty of that myself to some extent. But I would say a few things. So first of all, even if you accept the degeneracy side, let's call it the Dionysian side. Okay, fine. Sex, drugs, drinking, partying, whatever. There is a big question. Is that appropriate to show? And if you want to make reference to it, was there a better way of making reference to it? Because it wasn't just the Dionysian aspect or element. You could imagine Dionysius being part of the opening ceremonies in a sort of like subtle, only adults will get it nod to that part of, if you wanted to include it at all, which is an open question. Maybe you decide the noble lie, self-censorship, and just present the best foot forward and leave the rest of it, unsaid, or wink nudge, that kind of thing. But the other part of it was the Last Supper, what seemed like a deliberate insult to Christianity and to religious sensibilities, which again was probably uncalled for. And you can imagine different ways of making that Dionysian point that were not so openly insulting or openly pornographic, if I prefer to put it that way. So I would say that that's a part of it. And then my hunch, just a hunch, is that underlying that performance is also that kind of idea that, look, Olympics is all about inclusivity. We've got countries from all over the world. Okay, fine. Some are not represented officially, like Russia, right? You're not allowed to show their flag or play their music because everybody knows that Russians are bad. But okay, still, generally speaking, we're inclusive. We're going to include so many different sports. There's Olympic breakdancing and there's Olympic this, that, and the other thing. And our inclusivity is going to be reflected in the fact that we also, include transgenders and bearded women and all of these other sorts of things. And the subtle attack on Christianity may be part of this like view that we're even more inclusive than that, so it's like I saw that performance as the reduction to absurdity of the principle of inclusivity, where we're so inclusive that we're basically going to insult a lot of people. We're going to bring in material that's extraneous and unnecessary and has an effect contrary to the intended one. Again, I would have watched with my kids, I didn't, and so on. I'm not the only one. I'm probably one of millions in that position. So that, and another thing is art. Okay, this is a big question. I do want to just state it as it were for the record, not to hammer home Plato and Aristotle and that all of these are old questions, but the relationship between politics and art is an old question. Okay, it's written about not only in those books, more recently in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and we're faced with it in this example. Okay, art somehow seems like it should not be subject to censorship, to political oversight, to moralizing, to all of that. Somehow art should be allowed to tell the truth, or it should also be allowed to lie. It should be allowed to invent. It should be allowed to reflect. Art should somehow be an area of free creativity. And it seems totalitarian almost, fascist almost, to say, or authoritarian, you must make sure that your public art performances match our political principles and ideals. So if you watch the Chinese opening ceremonies or the Russian opening ceremonies, maybe there were people who thought, oh, look, that's totalitarian because they had their athletes do like classical performances. And that's the state abusing art to prop up the ideals of the state. So on one hand, it seems like art should be free. On the other hand, it seems like this Olympic example is an example of kind of state-sanctioned art, if it is inclusive, if it is meant to be basically DEI performance, as it were. So all of these issues are in play. My view, again, largely based on the Platonic tradition, there should be pockets of society where art can be free. But art does also have a political responsibility, and it does also must have, especially in events like this, I would say, political oversight. So the smoothest way would have been a subtler reference to the Dionysian element in life, in sports. And, the French used to be known for subtlety.
Yeah.
But here they sort of did not practice their historical virtue.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. The difference of what let's say if I was directing the Olympics opening ceremony for 2028, but I also had a separate art piece which I just wanted to communicate a performance apart from the Olympics, just as like, this is what I think the Olympics is about. And it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't a performance to bring people into the athletic games. It was just a separate art piece where I'm speaking totally for myself. And this is my interpretation of what it means to open the Olympic Games. And then I have the ceremony that's going to be broadcast to millions of people around the world right before the Olympics opens up. and I'm just trying to think of like what the difference between how different would they look if I was just speaking for myself, and if people hated me, they hated me, but they still would go see the Olympics because I had no affiliation with the Olympics. And if I was the creative director of the Olympic Games, I now have a responsibility to ensure the success of the games, and that is people viewing and people wanting to tune into the games, and people essentially sparking an interest in the athletes and getting as many people as possible interested in the athletes. So I don't know, I can't speak for the creative director of the Olympics, but I wonder if he got some wires crossed where he forgot the political responsibility, or just chose to ignore the political responsibility of being the shepherd of the games versus fulfilling his own personal creative appetite.
Yeah, that could very well be. I imagine the temptation is strong. You know, if you know that you are the centerpiece of a show that's going to have eyes on it around the world, you probably want to leave your fingerprints on it, or you know, it's the temptation to use it as a platform for your own creative outlet. I mean, it's built into it as part of the challenge, but you could take it too far. So in political science, political philosophy, political theory, there's this idea of authors. So now we're talking about books, not performances, but authors who have a public responsibility and want to say something, as it were, privately, and they write between the lines. You know, they have an art of saying two things at once. One thing for the person who just sees the surface, and something else for the few who can sort of put two and two together and read more deeply than the surface. And that in writing is how you can sort of get around that. You know, if you have one work, but you want to say two things, so you have to employ an art of writing between the lines. I don't know what it's like for a theater director, but that's why I say I could imagine a world in which he was still able to convey whatever he wanted to convey, but not with, like, I think I saw a clip that it was like a bearded lady dancing. You know, there would be like, there are subtler ways to try to say what you're trying to say. And though, you know, in the case of the authors, one of the big arguments for why people who write this way do that is to avoid persecution. Because if you say the thing that you want to say openly and you get caught, you get criticized, which is exactly what happened to this art director, right? Everybody saw that. It was not subtle enough. It became a huge issue. Advertisers pulled out. It was circulated however millions of times online until they had to do their, like, revoke the copyright grant and, you know, take the videos down. So that's another lesson about, I mean, maybe let's say the art director maybe knew there was going to be an outcry, wanted the outcry. Now people know who he is who wouldn't have known who he was otherwise. I mean, some people think all publicity is good publicity, even when it's critical like this. So there are many, you know, we could imagine scenarios where it was like a deliberate bomb designed to go off and just draw attention, or whether it was an overplayed hand. And that's the beauty, in some sense, of art. I think that it has all of these subversive potentials, but that needs to be balanced against the requirements of public decency and of political morality.
Yeah. It is what you said about the writing, having a performance or an art piece, and then was it some sort of writing or another version to go along with it?
Well, in my field, let's say, it's authors who write between the lines. So they write something on the surface, but if you actually follow along carefully with what they're saying, maybe they will deliberately contradict themselves. Maybe they'll leave hints in their writing for the more careful readers to show that there's like a subtext, you know? So they can count on leaving different messages for different people based on whether somebody is reading slowly or quickly, carefully or carelessly. But that allows them to preserve public decency on the surface and somehow only to leave the more subversive messages understated, hidden, and concealed. So they're there, but they're only there if you kind of know what to look for, or if you're, you know, slow reader. So I think artistic performances could do that. They could be more subtle, more suggestive, and less openly subversive.
Is there a specific example that comes to mind of a writer who has done that in your mind, where you read it and then you go back and read it again and you go, oh, I think they're also saying this?
Definitely, yeah. So in my field, political philosophy or political theory, There was a scholar named Leo Strauss who made this argument above all, that there's an art of writing between the lines, esoteric writing. He explained the reasons for it, and he directed our attention to the authors who do it. So I would say almost all the great authors in political philosophy do it because they feel really keenly this responsibility to convey one thing for the public appetite and another thing for the few thinkers. Not everybody is a thinker in the sense that they want to understand the deep ins and outs of political life. So there are many different ways the authors do this. Deliberate contradiction is one. So if I say, for example, if I say somewhere one thing and then I specifically say the opposite. So some people won't even notice the contradictions. You don't have to worry about them. They just won't notice any. They don't see that anything is weird in the first place. Some other people will say, oh, look, this guy contradicted himself. He must not know what he's talking about. But sometimes there can be contradictions that were designed to be deliberate, where it's like, I left you with one impression, but if you think it through, there's another one. So it's an amazing topic in the history of political philosophy. Usually it has to do with religious belief. Many times an author has to present himself as religious, even though beneath the surface, he's more doubtful, let's say, about the role of religion in public morality. Like he's more doubtful about the truth that there's a God who reveals himself and who reveals the moral law. That can be a necessary political belief, but a dubious philosophical belief. So sometimes authors have to be less than completely honest about that. But there are others as well, for sure. So yeah, it makes it exciting because it's sort of like when you know that that's possible, then then reading becomes detective work. You really have to you can't take anything for granted. You have to try to understand what's actually going on. Plato's Laws, the book I held up earlier, is an example. It has throughout examples like that, Plato's Republic and so on. So that art of writing between the lines is a necessary, learning to read between the lines becomes a necessary skill for understanding the history of political thought.
Yeah, what you're saying makes me think of stand-up comedy and stand-up comedy podcasts. And I don't know how much or how closely you follow the American stand-up sphere, but there's a lot of podcasts and they are trying to tell jokes, in the funniest way possible, which often means committing to absurd things or, shit that's going to get you taken down from YouTube versus what you can say in a club with 200 people with their phones locked up. And there's no restriction on what you can say, whether other than is it funny or is it not. People will let you know. And I have seen stand-ups perform live around New York, and your phones are locked up. And then I'll listen to a podcast with that same stand-up as a guest, or maybe they're hosting, but they're just on the episode and they're making a similar joke, but in a way that can be digested by the masses or digested by YouTube without it being flagged or taken down. But it's an incredibly, oftentimes a dirty joke or just like something you're not supposed to say outright, and they'll allude to it. Or it's not exactly the same as what it sounds like you're talking about with Leo Strauss or Plato, but there's like a subtextual way that comedians talk on podcasts that if you're paying attention, you get the joke. It just takes you're like, oh, I missed that. And you go back 15 seconds and then, you laugh like a fucking psychopath in your apartment by yourself. And then there's in a stand-up comedy club where you can just come out and say it and you don't have to worry about Netflix or YouTube or anything like that. So what you were saying just made me think about like the subtext of podcasts versus what you could say in the basement of a club.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's similar to the opening ceremony one too, because again, we can imagine an art performance that was just for 200 people versus for 200 million people, and the way that would be, it's the same similar principle. And comedians, there's something additional about the comedians that puts them into this category, which is that comics can openly laugh at things that are conventionally done or said or taken for granted. I mean, a big part of comedy, from what I understand, not so much as like somebody who watches comedy, but somebody who reads about it, is the attack on convention. So to be publicly responsible is somehow to pay lip service to the conventional beliefs. A comic is somebody who's sort of he's allowed to attack the conventional beliefs. He's given a lot of leeway. Like a comic can say the uncomfortable truths or can make, all the way from the moderate version that gets distributed on YouTube, which can still be pretty, it can still be an attack, all the way to the 200 Club, private thing. So it's an attack on convention. Why that's important, I think, for the Leo Strauss angle is because besides Plato, one of the old thinkers who sort of did this, he wrote different things in different ways to different people that were on the surface one message and beneath the surface a more serious message, was a comic playwright, and it was Aristophanes. So even classically, meaning thousands of years ago, the comedy was a vehicle for stating unpopular and uncomfortable truths with more immunity than you could do if you weren't a comic. So comics have a certain sort of immunity. They can talk about gender, they could talk about race, they could talk about all kinds of things under the protective armor of comedy. So that is very important, because that means comedy has philosophical significance because it's a form that allows you to speak about unpopular truths safely, somewhat safely, not perfectly safely, but more safely than if you weren't a comic. I think that's one of the reasons why. I don't say this is any great insight here. Maybe this is common knowledge for people who listen to contemporary comics, but a lot of people, if I'm not mistaken, turn today to comics for their political commentary because somehow the immunity that you have as a comic allows you to be more honest about what's going on in politics. Mm-hmm. So people isn't Dave Smith a comic that a lot of people look to for, political insight, and other people that Joe Rogan himself being a comic who. So I assume that this kinship of comedy and politics concerning truth telling in a safe way, again, safe because somehow if it's just comedy, you're protected from being a real threat. Yeah. But at the same time, you can say what everybody's thinking or maybe what nobody's thinking, but should be thinking. So comedy's a part of that.
It seems like you might enjoy Jimmy Carr. I don't know if you've watched Jimmy Carr, you've seen any long form interviews with him, but he's someone who seems to care deeply about not just making people laugh, but the philosophy of how people laugh, what they're laughing at, why they're laughing. And he cares deeply about the language of comedy and making it more accessible to people who aren't professional stand-up comedians. And I have felt that even just the act of consuming comedy has changed the way that I'll look at certain things. And it's probably the comedic infused part of my brain that when I look at the opening ceremony and I see people saying oh, this is blasphemy or this is degeneracy, my mind went to, oh, you should see what the fuck we talk about in a locker room. Or I've played with the fattest, drunkest degenerates, that are in the AA in, about to be called up to the major leagues. You have no idea what goes on behind the scenes in college baseball and professional baseball. And so that's going against convention. I think that's probably, not probably, it is useful in a lot of ways just to not even get you to think right, but just to get you to think differently. And I've experienced that through comedy. So Jimmy Carr is someone who talks a lot about that and the philosophy of comedy and how it changes the way you think.
I see. Okay. I appreciate the heads up. I don't know him. I don't watch a lot of the stand-up comedians, partially because I find the ones that I have heard, and I have gone to some comedy shows in some cities and not New York, but I don't there's a certain sort of overly vulgar comedy. Again, I'm down, as I also posted that day, I have a high tolerance for, let's call it the Dionysian. Okay. I have a high tolerance for the non-traditional or for the comic, for whatever we want to put under that. But there's a certain kind of race to the bottom that I don't like. There's a certain sort of comic who is just right away, female comic, first thing she's thought, unfunny jokes of the most vulgar kind. It doesn't have to be a female comic. Sometimes, whatever. It's so that the form that's oh, we're going to use the fact that comedy is allowed to be vulgar, and we're going to just go as vulgar as we possibly can. And that's going to be our substitute for humor, just total intense vulgarity. I don't find that funny, so there's a certain sort of sweet spot where it has to be intelligent enough, in my view. It can still be vulgar, but it can't just be it can't rely on pure vulgarity. Pure vulgarity is not in and of itself funny. And so comedy has to be funny. For me, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David, that's that's my cup of tea there. Okay, laughing at legal situations and just everyday ordinary disputes, that sort of thing. I used to like Stephen Wright, the Deadpan comic, but I can't say that I followed comics well enough to know all of the best of them. But the race to the bottom vulgarity is no good, and in my view, because again, it's just not funny. Comedy has to be, it's got to be all kinds of different things, but for sure, it's got to be funny.
Yeah. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's all. Like, so I don't know how common and widespread this like race to the bottom vulgar comic is, who's just trying to say, but that's what I've seen when I go to stand-up comedy shows most often. And to me, that's like no skill there.
I can send you some clips because I don't think the bottom of the barrel, just pure vulgarity is that widespread, at least not in the shows that I've listened to, the shows that I've attended in public, the podcasts that I've listened to. That's definitely part of the comedy sphere. And stand-up comedians will often go in and out of that. It's not just a pure, I'm this type of comic or this type of comic. They're often using different tools of the trade, if you will. But Dave Smith is a guy who is a good example of kind of going in and out because he has a very popular politics podcast called Part of the Problem. And he's also a co-host on a podcast called Legion of Skanks, where there's a lot of things that are vulgar on there that I find funny, and I think it's underrated for how smart it can actually be. I think it's like a very funny show that like talks up the vulgarity a lot to sort of scare people away, and that's like part of the enjoyment of the podcast is that people who haven't listened to it think it's just like the most disgusting, vile thing on the planet. And then you actually listen and it's pretty funny. I think it's really funny. So Dave Smith is a guy who's kind of goes in and out of both worlds. But yeah, I could send you some clips after we're done recording that are guys and girls who are more in that vein of the Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm, observational comedy, things that will hit that for you. I have some ideas in mind.
I'm open to it. I appreciate it. Please.
And I'll send you some vulgar ones too. I'll send you some bottom of the barrel ones too.
No problem. As I say, I don't mind. It's like anything. It can be done well or be done badly, I assume. So maybe I just haven't heard the best versions of it, which is fair enough.
How did you become enamored with philosophy in the first place? How did that become a lifelong pursuit for you?
So my when I was like 15 or so, let's say, I had books that I was reading. So I started probably getting bookish in my early teens, and I was reading kind of what I had around the house, which was, I have an older brother, older sister. They were into some of these books. It was like existentialism, beatnik sort of stuff. Some cases like Jungian psychology or mystical things. And I took a liking to all of that. Okay. So I was reading it. I thought it was interesting. And I would say I started to form a big attraction to mysticism. Okay. To people who had mystical experiences or mystical symbolism. I got sort of attracted to all of that. And then I'll spare you a long story, but at some point I went to university and I took a philosophy 101 class. And that's where everything clicked for me in a big way. So I took my existing interest in religion and mysticism, my probably like ingrained personality type, which is again, open in a certain sort of way it's attracted both to like traditional themes and to sort of chaos. I'm not like pure chaos, not pure order. Like I'm attracted to, it took my temperament, my background interest in mysticism, and then it puts something that was missing into the picture. And when that missing thing was into the picture, I'm like, that's it. From the moment that happened in my first philosophy class, I lucked out because some people, they take a philosophy class and it's a dud. They have a teacher who's garbage, or they have readings that are garbage, or they're just not primed. It's too early or it's too late. There are like a million things that can go wrong. No, for me, that didn't happen. For me, everything went right. And started from Plato. The first book we read was Plato's Republic. And immediately I was attracted to what I thought were the mystical elements of Plato's thought. So some people know there's the cave allegory. They're like, we're all kind of like prisoners in a cave. There's shadows. We have to exit the cave and see the world as it is. I'm giving a popularized version of it. Well, Plato's cave allegory, if people read it who haven't read it before, for a long time, it was like the centerpiece of mystical speculation. Because not only do you get out of the cave from the shadows out into the open sky, but there's also like you look at the sun And the sun is an image that was mystically interpreted as basically like mystical union with the Almighty. What does it mean to look at the sun? Basically, it means to have like immediate intuitive apprehension of God. So that like matched all my pre-existing mystical inclinations. But what it added to them was, number one, the centrality of reflection on politics. I didn't have this until I started studying Plato. So that was missing. I had religion, I had mysticism, I had existential, all this sort of thing, but I didn't see the centrality of reflection on politics until my first philosophy class, largely because of Plato. And that never changed. That's why I showed you Plato's laws. That stuck with me. The minute I saw that, that became a part of my DNA. And then the other thing was the role of reason. Because in the mystical tradition, there's a lot of like what's ineffable, what can't be stated, what's intuitive, what's emotional, what's transrational, transcendental. But the beautiful thing about philosophy, especially about Plato for me, was how much you can still say using human reason, clear argumentation. So that fit into place, that clicked. I had my pre-existing intuitive mystical inclinations. Then I added classical political rationalism. And that was just like big bang for me, that was an intellectual orgasm. So understanding the importance of reflection on politics, understanding just how much you can comprehend using reason and intelligence, and then seeing the effect of Plato on the whole history of political thought and recognizing that reflection on politics, it's not some sideshow. It's central to the human experience. We live in political communities. Tomorrow, if there's a tyranny in your country, the law can just declare that you should be lined up put up against the wall and shot. Politics can be a matter of life and death. It has huge significance. And the last thing I'll say about this is that one of the elements of mysticism that to me is attractive is you're like uniting the soul to God. So you're thinking like these are the two fundamental deep realities of human life. But politics you can't just ignore the centrality of political life. That's like the soul, it can't get to the highest mystical ecstasies without understanding that it lives in an ordinary political context. And Plato is the mastermind who helps understand what is the meaning of politics for the ordinary human being, to my mind. So that's what set me off. Like, that's it. After that first philosophy class, which I said, we read Plato, we read Descartes, we read other things. Then I studied with that teacher other classes on medieval Latin thought, medieval Arabic thought, and I just fell in love with this kind of reflection, and I'm still in love with it. And I teach it, and if I didn't have people to teach it to, I would still just study it on my own. And I'm going to take it with me to the grave, and if there's a beyond, to the beyond, because that's what this is for me. Philosophy, political philosophy, it's so highly recommended. If people don't know that world, start anywhere and keep going.
Yeah, you said something that stuck with me as I was going down the rabbit hole of your YouTube channel, which I highly recommend and will be linked wherever people are listening to this or watching the podcast. I think it was, you were talking about Curtis Yarvin, but somehow Plato's Cave came up, and you said that anyone who gets interested in a serious manner in political philosophy has won the lottery. And I was kind of like, whoa, like maybe I'm fucking missing something here. I've not had an awakening, an orgasmic awakening in the philosophical sense that you've described, but it's certainly what you've said has caused me to slightly orientate to where I, maybe want to shift a couple degrees, because I'm probably missing something by not reading some of history's greatest philosophers or listening to people like yourself talking about it. So that was just something that stuck with me. But yeah, so that moment, the politics and the mysticism, everything kind of coming together over that period, that's sort of what cemented philosophy and politics as like this life or death thing. I'm just gonna go for it, whatever happens.
Yeah, that's right. So that once that interest was in place, nothing could shake it. I do want to say, to be fair, I assume there are people who have their own passions, and to them, it's like whatever their passion is also winning the lottery, whether it's like biking or origami or something like that. So, look, it could be that I'm just over exaggerating my own particular passion here, but I do think it's more than that. I want to be fair to everybody who's got their own interests. This happens to be mine, but I do think that inherent in the topic of political philosophy, there's something that is like especially significant because of its comprehensiveness, because it touches us at so many different points, and because it provides occasion for reflection on basic concepts like what is justice, what is good and bad, what is progress, what is power, what is law, what's legitimacy. These are deep and important questions that you get in the field of politics that you don't necessarily get in every other area of human interest and inquiry. But yeah, so that was cemented. And then I just continued to pursue it. And my pursuit of it brought me to some old authors. Like I said, Plato is one who's lasted with me for a long time. It helped me to discover some new people like Alexander Dugin, a Russian thinker that I work on, that I've translated his books and, had ups and downs in the reception of my interest in him because he's considered a controversial thinker. He's alive, very pro-Russian, anti-Western, anti-liberal guy. But he also has an interest in politics and philosophy and mysticism. So therefore I became interested in him myself. And yeah, that's what I would say. That was the key thing. Leo Strauss, a guy I mentioned earlier, he was very helpful for me because his commentaries helped me to see how much is going on in these books that I couldn't necessarily get by myself. So like in any field, I think when you have a great teacher should help you to see more and to do more than you could do on your own. He was, for me, a great teacher. I never studied with him personally, but in his books. And now I try to do that with my students as well.
Yeah. This may have been the long story short that you glossed over, but I read your Substack story about the traveling mystic, and I think this was before you had that awakening moment, orgasmic moment, whatever you want to call it. Can you? And I know it's a long story, and it's one of the most fascinating pieces of writing I've read. I was completely hooked from start to finish. Can you retell the story of the traveling mystic, aka Storm Corleone, or at least walk me through that saga? Because I just think it's super interesting and like how you guys collided and how everything happened.
Sure. So I was out of high school, but I was not yet in university. I didn't have plans to go to university. I was just sort of drifting, you could say, to some extent. I had other plans. I wanted to go to an audio recording school or something like that, but I didn't have clear plans. And I met somebody who was playing guitar on the streets. So again, it's hard to walk through the whole thing. It's actually a pretty dramatic moment in my life at the time. But what happened in effect was I met a guy who was busking. Okay, he was playing guitar on the streets. And he offered me, as it were, like an apprenticeship, like an apprenticeship. So he offered me to busk with him, and he would sort of initiate me into the soul of a blues artist. So a blues artist is somebody who, has had a run-in with the devil, who has some scars on his soul, who's willing to sacrifice a lot for the sake of soulfulness. And this person struck me that way. It was kind of weird. I definitely felt like there was some greater force at play. Like I felt like this is not going to capture it, but from the outside, I would say I felt like I was in a movie for sure. The closest movie that I've seen that comes to it is Training Day. If people have ever seen Training Day, I watched Training Day once after this run-in, and I was like, flashbacks in a sense. So
did he remind you of Denzel, or who?
Yeah,
would
he reminded me of Denzel, exactly. Wow. Not just that he reminded me of Denzel, but the experience that I had reminded me of the experience that was conveyed in the movie in a big way. So anyway, I agreed to do this sort of like apprenticeship. Okay, so this guy was a busker. His name was Storm Corleone. He was a Black Sicilian. He had a buddy who used to be a white nationalist. They met in prison. So it was like a black guy and a white nationalist busking on the streets, all kinds of crazy songs. And we'd have big audiences coming from Detroit because we were playing across the river from Detroit. This was when Windsor was still a city that had a lot of people. So it was a wild, wild experience. Okay. I don't even know how to convey the details, but what happened is I put aside all my life plans to go on the road with this person. We did go on the road. We did busk. At some point, I no longer wanted to do that, and I was effectively like kidnapped or held hostage, you could say, in that situation. And
could you
yeah, I
say
don't know.
it,
It's
or
hard,
is that
hard to walk.
actually?
It's hard to walk through the details.
Could you?
It was
Let
weird.
me see if I could prompt
weird...
it a little bit. So, what do you remember the moment where you decided to give up whatever life you were leading for at least a period of time, whether it was kidnapping or a total autonomy or somewhere in between? Do you remember that moment and what the immediate aftermath was of like the coming days and weeks?
Yeah. So, okay, look, I was planning on going to an audio recording school, like I said. Then I met this person. We started playing music. I felt like I was undergoing some spiritual, psychological, musical initiation. And I decided that I was not going to go according to my plans. I was going to follow my destiny, which is what this was increasingly seeming like. I was going to follow my destiny come what may. And I was going to hit the road with this person to play music. Okay, I was going to become a traveling musician. So no, I think at one point he told me, I was giving up the world of a golden cage. What's a golden cage? A golden cage is you have no freedom. Somehow everything is provided for, but you have no freedom. And on the other side of that was a life that was going to be difficult for people to understand from the outside, but that represented a serious kind of inner freedom. It was like a breaking with the world. By the way, I remember, so this was 2000, this was 2001. And so I definitely felt like I'm stepping into my destiny. I'm going off the beaten track. I know that what I'm doing is going to seem strange to everybody else around me. It's going to be inexplicable. It's not something I'm going to be able to convey. But when you have a muse, or when you have, whatever correct image is to think about, you're just dialed into that. So that's what I was dialed into. And that's what we did. It was this weird musical apprenticeship. I did hit the road with him. And the feeling or sensation that I had when we first started was, like I said, purely musical, in the sense of there's some muse, there's some destiny, there's some strange fate. This is mine and I'm all in on it. I don't know where it's going to lead me. I just know that I have to sort of follow it. There's a very strong sense like that. Obviously, as an older person now, or if I put myself in the shoes of the people who are around me, it was incomprehensible. It couldn't possibly have made sense to anybody from the outside looking in. But sometimes that's what it looks like when you follow what you feel like is your destiny.
So there's a scene in Training Day where Denzel makes I forgot Ethan Hawke. Is it Ethan Hawke? Yeah. The name of his character, but Denzel makes Ethan Hawke smoke what he tells him is weed, and it turns out being PCP. And you could see the wheels turning in Ethan Hawke's mind once he sobers up, that maybe Denzel's not the cop that I thought he was, or, he's not the guy I pictured him to be. Did you have a parallel moment like that with Storm, with the Traveling Mystic, where you're like, I don't think this is the guy that I initially pictured?
Yes, there were moments like that for sure. I think it's better not to get into the details, but there were moments like that. And, the culminating moment is the one that I did write about in that piece on the Traveling Mystic. The culminating moment is the one where I had the impression, once we were already on the road, that I would be free to leave. And he gave me that impression. He gave me that false impression. And he let me know that I would be, punished, basically, for wanting to leave. So he played me pretty badly at the almost last stage of our drama. And that was just straight out of a movie. There's no other way to put it. You couldn't have scripted it. So yeah, that was extremely unpleasant. That was probably, I would say in some sense, thank God I haven't lived a crazier life, but that was probably the lowest moment of my life that I can remember, because that was like, wow, completely blindsided. And there were all sorts of, it was very ugly, unexpected, completely bad scenario. But as I also write about in that piece, the resolution of this bad scenario was also like something that I think couldn't have been scripted, which is he had a turnaround. He had some sort of moment of clarity, or his conscience hit, or who knows what, but the battle between good and evil in his soul, temporarily at least, good won out. I'm curious somehow whether that's true in the long run. But at the time, let's say he had two inclinations. One was like completely destroy my life, which is where I thought things were going. And by the way, to destroy my life meant, as I wrote in that piece, to like destroy the lives of my family. Like it could be, if you really want to hurt somebody, you don't go after that person, you go after what that person loves. So it's like that was a real dark possibility. But in the midst of this dark moment, he was overcome with repentance. And he told me, when he came to make amends with me, when I was basically in hell, that he remembered the moment my mom prayed for us before we left on our road trip. And he told me that that was the only time in his life that he ever bowed his head in prayer. So that to me is also like insane, cinematic, deep, moving, significant, in a way that I don't know that anything, nothing is just so strange. Like you had like maybe I was part of his destiny, maybe he was part of my destiny. I don't know why it worked out this way, but we went from things being very dark and very much like there's no way out of a hellhole, to he remembered my mother's prayer that he bowed his head to, he repented, and he went over to the good side. He went over to the light. And from that moment on until I had my last communication with him, basically when I did part ways from him, genuinely it was like there was no more rocky road. Like he made it smooth sailing for me to go on with my life. But I guess people can read that if they want to. It was such, I mean, I don't even have I can describe what happened like I try to do in that piece. I don't really have the words to convey it, because all I can say is it was like the lowest low and this weird moral resolution at the end. And I was caught up in the midst of it, and it seems crazy that it ever happened, but it did. And I only hope that, whatever that battle of good and evil was in his heart, that, evil stayed defeated for the long run. But yeah, we had, there were crazy moments, not all of which I would be willing to discuss. And that's just what it was. It was this weird. So when I said earlier that, I have a high tolerance for chaos or like the non-beaten path, I wasn't somebody who was like, in high school, I was thinking about university. And the minute I graduated high school, I knew I went to the best university. I had this weird little intermediary period, where it was like what I just said, felt like the ground was slipping beneath my feet. I was busking. There was weird musical initiation, weird characters, crazy stuff. And that's just what it was. So in hindsight, I should say, I never really know what to make of what happened. Like I'm older now. I was 17 then, I'm 40 now. Okay. So sometimes I think, boy, that was stupid. Maybe I should never have done that. Maybe my life would have been much different in a good way if I had just done the beaten path. Like if I went to audio recording school and, I never had this crazy run-in. But actually, I do feel like the scars on the soul were a necessary thing. It's just like, it's something that had to happen. It's something that it's good that it happened. And again, the one unknown for me really is, whether the angel or the devil took hold of him when we parted ways.
Yeah. What was was it arson that he threatened your family with, or what was the threat that you wrote about towards the end?
So what I wrote about is there were people, there were people in and around who could have been fire starters, and things like that. So, like it was, as I say, there were some dark moments there, which I'm glad didn't play out the way they could have.
And then there was the transition where, at least for however long you stayed with Storm after that, it was like darkness to light, like you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. Like first it was pretty straightforward. We were playing music, then there were some Denzel moments where it was less obvious what exactly I'd gotten myself into and whether it made sense to stick. At some point the apprenticeship ends. Like, maybe at some point it seemed like, okay, it's a good time to go. And then, as I mentioned, he gave me the impression that I could go. I got played, and he left me high and dry for a minute with all kinds of threats about what I could expect to happen to me and to the people around me. And then there was the moment where he had thank God, a moment of good versus evil where good won out. Then he came and he made it actually possible for me to go. And then I left, and that was basically it. So that was like some strange little episode in my life and in his life. And, it doesn't really matter if I wish it went differently or it did happen or didn't happen. It is what it is, and it was what it was. And I have tried to reflect on it from time to time. Again, I thought it would be interesting to write about, cathartic in a sense. And for me, the story ends in a way with, and this is kind of arbitrary, everybody who writes a book or does an artistic performance or has some conception for a movie, they get to decide whether they leave it on a high note or a low note, whether they try to undermine what was good about it or amplify what was bad about it. And the fact that he had been redeemed by a mother's prayer at the end of my involvement with the story is sort of the high note I prefer to leave it on. And I almost don't even want to know what came next.
Yeah, it did make me think about the concept of identity and the concept of the self, and reading about someone who can ditch, because you were going to audio engineering school, you shucked that life, and then you became a traveling musician, and you went on, and this what sounds like a very chaotic, beautiful, short run where audio engineer doesn't seem like it was at all a part of your identity, or future audio engineer. You weren't really thinking about that in the moment. And so I was thinking, applying that to my own life, am I becoming too attached to my own identity? Is an identity, is it a good thing to have in identities? Is like my whole concept of self more shatterable than I think it is? Can I just take off one day and, instead of being a content creator or a podcaster, I'm playing violin on the street and I'm just traveling around Europe or Southeast Asia or wherever, or, I become a lawyer, like, who the hell knows? But like, because I've painted this picture of myself one way, am I precluding myself from experiences, even if they're short term, just for a few weeks or a few months, that, I don't see that as my identity. So I go, that is not me. But the only thing keeping it not me is that I don't do it. And the second I did start to do it, that would be a part of my identity, and I wouldn't feel this conflict anymore. So I don't even know. It still makes me think, and there's no question there. But I just want to let you know it's a very thought-provoking piece.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Hopefully people who read it get something valuable from it. I do think, there's again, my experience and my thought is that there's extreme breaks in identity. Sometimes people can have something horrible happen and they really have to stop and ask themselves, like, who am I? And there are probably healthy boundaries within which people can discover something new about themselves. I started doing jujitsu about almost 2 years ago now. I never would have thought about myself as somebody who does a martial art or as somebody who's athletic or cares about athletic performance. That's completely new. And now it's part of how I see myself, never how I saw myself in the past. But there's also, in the mystics, as I told you, that was always the key reference point for me, starting from my early teens. There's this idea of a dark night of the soul, which is kind of like a crisis that people go through that is necessary for whatever the next, whatever the deeper insight is. And so I saw what happened to me was kind of like a dark night of the soul. It was and some people maybe never have one, or some people have one that they maybe have over a long period of time. Mine just happened to have been like intense, amplified, fast, and early. And that's just what it was. But yeah, the question, how we see ourselves, who we are, how we can remake ourselves. Again, back in those days, I just want to add, in case I don't really mention this sort of thing often, but I'll say it here because maybe it's interesting. Like again, in the early teens, I was reading things about playing with the plasticity of our identity in the following way. It was like, take a ring, for example. This is my wedding ring. And, wear it 3 days a week. Okay. So 3 days a week it's on, and the 4 days a week it's off. And when it's on, I never did this, but to give you an example, it's one of the exercises that I read about in one of these crazy books I was reading at the time. When the ring is on, you should have like one personality. And when the ring is off, you should have a different personality. And basically they're like psychological experiments that you run on yourself to show just how plastic identity can be, so that people don't fall into it. Now, I think the integrated self is also a very desirable model. So like on one hand, let's say you have the integrated self. On the other hand, you have the schizophrenic self. I'm not telling people but somehow, somehow I will say this. One of the most memorable moments for me in that episode I had, there were many, okay? Almost like every day was its own crazy little adventure. But one of the most memorable episodes I had was that I had bought a new acoustic guitar, Epiphone EJ200, beautiful, shiny. I polished it so there wasn't a single fingerprint on it, okay? Like I wanted to make sure it was sparkling, right? Perfect, immaculate. And I brought it out to the street to play with this guy. And one of the first things he did was he took a coin out of the case, because at that time people still carried change, and that's what they would do. They'd throw change into the case. Now I don't know how you could busk. You have to have some sort of ATM or something. But he took a coin out of the case. Exactly. He took a coin out of the case and he put a big gash in the guitar. You keep in mind, I was polishing out every fingerprint. He put a big gash in the guitar and he said, the guitar is too pretty. You can't play the blues with a guitar that's so pretty. And somehow that to me is a deeper metaphor for scars on the soul and for somehow a deep experience of life. It's not that I would wish it upon other people, but for me, it had that sort of symbolic resonance. You can't play the blues if you're polishing every fingerprint off your guitar. You can only do it if you have some sort of scars on your soul. So those two things, they go together.
That's your Joker moment. That's someone coming up to you. That's the Joker's dad coming up to you and saying, "Why so serious?" And then carving a scar into your mouth. Just him taking the coin, putting it against the guitar, going, "Yeah, that's too pretty. I'm gonna fuck it up a little bit."
Yeah, I remember that feeling. I didn't like it. Think about trying to keep something without a fingerprint, and then somebody goes and puts a big gash in it like that.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But you know what? Somehow it broke a barrier that I feel was important to break. It taught me a lesson that I feel was a valuable lesson. So it's very morally ambiguous to me, that whole period. Because again, it's not like I would want my kids to go through that. If I was an outsider, I'd say this is crazy. Anybody looking in would say, "What are you doing?" Like there are a million other paths you could take that would be better. And still, it seemed necessary to go through.
Yeah. Well, Michael Millerman, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Where is the best place for people to follow you, to keep up with your work? Please plug anything that you want people to check out. And I'm going to link everything in the intro and wherever people are listening or watching this.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So youtube.com/@Millerman is where I put up all my videos. They're on politics, philosophy, and in some cases mysticism. So people should follow on YouTube if they want my video presentations. MillermanSchool.com is where I teach philosophy online. So there are courses there that people can buy, private tutoring. I've also started doing advising for like finance people and organizations. So that is something I'm available for if anybody's interested. And then the story that you and I were just talking about, that's at millermanschool.substack.com. And I post, Twitter is the main social media where I just post whatever comes to mind. And I don't even remember. I think it's M_Millerman. But if you just search Millerman, I'll come up on all these different places. I've got a couple of books on political philosophy and so on. But if people just want to hear me talk like you and I have been talking, then all of those places would be good to check out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.